How China Learned to Build Everything, the Deal That Gave China the Future. January 11th, 1994. Shanghai. A cold rain hammered the windows of the Peace Hotel as Helmut Werner, chairman of Mercedes-Benz, signed a joint venture agreement with officials from the Shanghai Automotive Industry Corporation. The champagne flowed, the translators smiled. Werner believed he was entering the greatest market expansion in automotive history. He was wrong. He wasn't signing a business deal. He was signing a confession that would transfer 70 years of German engineering secrets to a government that had no intention of staying a customer. We've been told that China's rise was inevitable, that it was about hard work and determination. That's the fairy tale. The truth is simpler and far more brutal. China didn't rise because of communism or capitalism. China rose because Western CEOs traded the future for a quarterly earnings report. They handed over the blueprints. They opened the vaults. And they got paid in access to a market that would eventually devour them. This is not a story about theft. It's a story about a transaction. The greatest wealth transfer in human history happened in boardrooms, not back alleys. At the peak of the late 20th century, the West believed it owned the future. American factories produced the best cars, the fastest planes, the most powerful computers. German engineering was synonymous with precision. Japanese trains moved like silver bullets across the landscape. French energy companies powered entire continents. The intellectual property held in the vaults of Detroit, Stuttgart, Tokyo, and Paris was worth trillions. Patents on engines, turbines, software, semiconductors. These were the crown jewels of industrial civilization. Western executives looked at their balance sheets and saw stagnation. The American car market was saturated. Every household already owned 2 cars. Profit margins were shrinking as competition intensified. Then they turned their eyes eastward and saw something that made their hearts race. 1.2 billion people. A nation waking from decades of isolation. A population that owned almost nothing. They saw a gold rush. They saw the California frontier of 1849 multiplied by 1,000. But beneath the surface, a different calculation was being made. In the halls of Zhongnanhai, the leadership compound in Beijing, Chinese officials were drafting something the West never bothered to read carefully. It was called the Law on Sino-Foreign Equity Joint Ventures. Passed in 1979, revised in 1990, it was dry legal language. But buried in Article 7 was a clause that would reshape the global economy. If you wanted to manufacture in China, you couldn't do it alone. You had to partner with a Chinese state-owned enterprise. You couldn't own more than 50% of the venture, and you had to transfer your technology. Not suggest, not offer, transfer. It was mandatory. The West read it and shrugged. They thought the Chinese were backward peasants who would take decades to understand modern engineering. They thought they could keep the best secrets locked away in Germany and America while feeding China the old models. They were catastrophically wrong. Let's follow the money. In 1984, Volkswagen signed the first major joint venture to produce cars in China. They partnered with SAIC, the Shanghai Automotive Industry Corporation. SAIC at the time was a nothing enterprise. It made primitive tractors and sedans that broke down constantly. Volkswagen brought in German engineers, German machinery, German blueprints for the Santana sedan. The Santana was an old design, a boxy sedan that was already outdated in Europe, but in China it was revolutionary. It had air conditioning. It had a functioning radio. It started every morning. For Volkswagen, this was a gold mine. They made billions. Their market share in China soared to over 50%. But here's what they didn't notice. Every day on the factory floor, SAIC engineers were watching. They were copying the supply chain structure. They were learning quality control. They were studying the metallurgy of the engine blocks. And because they were 50% owners, they had legal access to everything. Every blueprint, every technical manual, every process improvement. For 2 decades, Volkswagen counted their profits and ignored the signs. Then in 2010, something shifted. The Chinese government announced a new priority: electric vehicles. They realized they would never beat Germany at internal combustion engines. The Germans had a century head start. So they changed the rules of the game. They funneled subsidies into electric vehicle companies. BYD, a battery maker, became a car company overnight. NIO emerged with designs that looked suspiciously familiar to German engineers. Geely, another domestic brand, launched electric sedans using platforms that seemed to echo the joint ventures. And SAIC itself, the partner that Volkswagen had taught everything, launched its own brand. The Row. It had the same chassis mounting points as a Volkswagen. The suspension geometry was nearly identical. When Volkswagen complained, the Chinese government smiled politely and pointed to the contracts. Everything was legal. You agreed to this. Today in 2025, Volkswagen's market share in China has collapsed. They're closing factories. They're laying off workers in Germany. And Chinese electric cars are flooding Europe. BYD outsells Volkswagen in multiple markets. The student became the master. The technology transferred in 1984 mutated, evolved, and returned to hunt its creator. But cars were just the beginning. Let's talk about trains. In 2004, China's railway system was a disaster. Slow, overcrowded, dangerous. The Chinese government wanted high-speed rail, like Japan's Shinkansen or France's TGV, but they didn't know how to build it. So they announced the largest infrastructure project in history. 12,000 miles of high-speed track. Contracts worth tens of billions of dollars. Every major train manufacturer in the world lined up. Siemens from Germany, Alstom from France, Kawasaki from Japan, Bombardier from Canada. They were salivating. But the Ministry of Railways set the trap again. You can bid, but you must partner with CSR or CNR, our state-owned manufacturers, and you must transfer the technology. Complete blueprints for the trains, the motors, the braking systems, the signaling software, everything. The executives at Kawasaki in Japan hesitated. They knew what happened in the auto industry. But Siemens and Alstom were desperate for revenue. They convinced themselves they could hold back the most advanced secrets. They signed. Kawasaki transferred the E2 series Shinkansen technology. Siemens transferred the Velorotrain design. For a few years, the Western companies made solid profits selling parts and consulting. Behind the scenes, Chinese engineers launched what they officially called the Digestion and Reinnovation Program. That was the actual government term. Digestion, like biology. You eat something, break it down, absorb the nutrients, grow stronger. They disassembled the Japanese trains bolt by bolt. They analyzed the metallurgy of the wheels using spectrometers. They tested the aerodynamics in wind tunnels. Then they started mixing components, a Japanese nose on a German body. They rewrote the software to improve performance. In 2010, just 6 years after the contracts were signed, China unveiled the CRH-380A. They called it an indigenous Chinese innovation. Engineers at Kawasaki looked at photographs and recognized their own design choices, even the same minor flaws they had corrected years earlier. It was a clone, but it was a clone on steroids. Then the nightmare scenario arrived. China stopped buying foreign trains. Why purchase an expensive Siemens train when a domestic CRH model cost 30% less and performed nearly the same? Siemens, Alstom, Kawasaki were frozen out of the Chinese market entirely. They had been squeezed dry. And then China did something even more audacious. They merged CSR and CNR into a single state champion called CRRC. It became the largest train manufacturer on Earth. And CRRC started bidding for contracts in Boston, Los Angeles, London, across Africa. Using the technology practically gifted to them, they undercut the very companies that taught them. It was ruthless. It was brilliant. It was a long con played with the patience of a civilization that thinks in centuries, not quarters. While the rail industry was being digested, the energy sector was about to witness something even more brazen. This wasn't reverse engineering. This was theft, corporate espionage. This is the story of American Superconductor, a Massachusetts company that built the software brains for wind turbines. They didn't make the turbines themselves. They made the control systems. The sophisticated code that tells a turbine how to spin, how to pitch the blades, how to connect to the power grid safely. It's incredibly complex. It's the secret sauce. Their biggest customer was Sinovel, the largest wind turbine maker in China. It was a perfect partnership. AMSC stock soared. Then in 2011, Sinovel suddenly stopped placing orders. The executives in Massachusetts were confused. They called Beijing repeatedly. Sinovel ghosted them. Then AMSC discovered something terrifying. Their software was running on Sinovel turbines in the field, but it was a version they never released. They sent investigators to climb the wind towers. They hacked into the systems remotely. They found their own source code running on the machines. The copyright notices had been deleted, but the digital fingerprints were unmistakable. How did Sinovel get it? They found a weak link. Dejan Karabasevic, a Serbian engineer, working for AMSC's Austrian subsidiary. He was unhappy, underpaid, resentful. Sinovel agents approached him quietly. They offered money, lots of it. Reports suggest they offered other incentives too. It was a classic intelligence operation. In 2011, Karabasevic cracked the encryption, downloaded the source code, and handed it over. Sinovel uploaded the stolen software directly into their turbines. MSC's stock crashed 70% in days. They fired half their workforce. The company was gutted. They sued and eventually won a verdict years later. But by then, the damage was irreversible. Sinovel had used the stolen code to dominate the market. AMSC was left a shell. This was the wake-up call. The game had changed. This wasn't hard bargaining. This was war. But the ultimate prize wasn't trains or turbines. It was the sky itself. Boeing and Airbus, the duopoly that ruled global aviation for half a century. They thought they were untouchable. Building a commercial jet is the hardest engineering challenge on Earth. Millions of parts, insane safety standards, decades of expertise. China would never catch up. They were wrong again. Enter COMAC, the Commercial Aircraft Corporation of China. The Chinese government looked at the billions they spent buying Boeing 737s and Airbus A320s every year and said enough. We want our own plane. They launched the C919 project, and they used the Market for Technology playbook one final time. They invited Western suppliers to join. Honeywell, General Electric, Rockwell Collins, Parker Aerospace. These companies make the engines, avionics, landing gear. COMAC told them clearly, if you want to be on the C919, you must form a joint venture with a Chinese partner. Honeywell wants to sell flight controls? Form a venture with a factory in Xi'an. GE wants to sell avionics? Partner with Avic. The U.S. government issued warnings. They told these companies they were training their replacement. But the lure of the Chinese market was magnetic. China was projected to become the world's largest aviation market within a decade. Trillions of dollars in new orders. The suppliers signed. Today, the C919 is flying. It looks like an Airbus A320. It flies like one, but it's stamped made in China. Critics correctly note it's still assembled from Western components. The engines are French-American designs. But that's not the point. The goal isn't today. The goal is 2035, 2045. Every year, the Chinese partners in those joint ventures are learning. They're learning turbine blade metallurgy. They're learning flight control algorithms. They're playing the long game. And while the West celebrated short-term profits, China was preparing its master stroke. In 2015, the government released a policy document that sent shockwaves through Washington and Berlin. It was called Made in China 2025. It wasn't propaganda. It was a roadmap. It listed 10 industries where China planned total self-sufficiency. Robotics, aerospace, electric vehicles, semiconductors, biomedicine, artificial intelligence. It was an explicit declaration. The era of copying is over. The era of innovation begins. We don't want to assemble your iPhone. We want to design the next one. We don't want to stitch your shoes. We want to own the brand. This policy document was the catalyst for the trade war. It's why the U.S. banned Huawei from American networks. It's why we're watching a technological iron curtain descend. But to understand how Made in China 2025 works, you need to understand a cultural phenomenon. A word that used to mean fake, but now means fast. Shanzhai. In the early 2000s, Shanzhai phones flooded the electronics markets of Shenzhen. Cheap knockoffs. Nokia instead of Nokia. Samsung instead of Samsung. They fooled nobody, but something interesting happened. The people making these phones started improvising. They added huge batteries because migrant workers couldn't charge phones regularly. They added 4 SIM card slots to switch carriers. They added massive speakers. They iterated faster than Apple or Samsung ever could. This Shanzhai culture evolved into companies like DJI, the drone maker. DJI started small, but iterated so fast it destroyed every American and European competitor. Today, DJI owns 70% of the global consumer drone market. It evolved into ByteDance, the company behind TikTok, an algorithm so addictive it conquered global attention in 3 years. The West still thinks China can only copy, but the reality is the copycat became the creator, and the West paid for the entire education. Now we arrive at the final battlefield, the semiconductor war, the chip war. For decades, China has been desperate to build its own computer chips. They spend more importing chips than importing oil. It's their greatest vulnerability. If America stops selling chips, the Chinese economy stops. Smartphones go dark, cloud servers crash, missiles can't fly. So the Chinese government launched the Big Fund, a massive war chest of billions to build a domestic chip industry. But here's the problem. You can't copy a microchip like you copy a car. Modern chips are the most complex objects humans have ever made. Billions of transistors, each smaller than a virus. To build them, you need a machine from one company, ASML in the Netherlands. These lithography scanners cost $200 million each. They're the size of a bus. They use lasers and molten tin to print patterns only atoms wide. China desperately wanted these machines. But this time the copycat engine hit a wall. The U.S. government realized if China got ASML's EUV machines, they'd be unstoppable. They'd build AI chips, unhackable encryption, hypersonic missile guidance. So America convinced the Dutch government to ban the export. It was a chokehold. China was furious. They called it technological containment. Since they couldn't buy the machines, they tried to buy the people. This is the hidden front, the talent war. China launched programs like the 1,000 Talents Plan. Find the best scientists working at Intel, at NASA, at MIT. Offer them money, labs, respect. Bring them home. Sometimes it was legal recruitment. Sometimes it crossed into espionage. There have been cases of engineers downloading thousands of files onto hard drives and booking one-way tickets to Beijing. They stole photoricist formulas, memory controller designs, fabrication processes. But there's one story that serves as the ultimate warning, the story of Nortel. In the 1990s, Nortel was one of the largest tech companies on Earth. They built the backbone of the Internet, fiber optics, wireless data networks. They were worth 1/3 of the Toronto Stock Exchange. But inside Nortel headquarters in Ottawa, something was wrong. Executives noticed microphones turning on by themselves, strange data leaving servers at night, listening devices hidden in boardrooms. They'd been hacked, completely. The hackers had access to everything. CEO emails, technical manuals, pricing strategies. And the beneficiary? A small company in Shenzhen. Why? At the time, Huawei was a reseller of telephone switches. Suddenly, they started producing hardware identical to Nortel's, but 30% cheaper. When Nortel bid for contracts, Huawei bid just lower. They knew Nortel's pricing before Nortel submitted bids. Nortel started bleeding money. They lost contract after contract. In 2009, Nortel filed for bankruptcy, the biggest corporate failure in Canadian history. Tens of thousands lost jobs. Pensioners lost savings. The Ottawa campus was so riddled with spyware the Canadian government had to strip it to concrete. And Huawei? They hired ex-Nortel engineers, took over the market, became the world leader in 5G. Nortel was the host. Huawei was the parasite. The parasite killed the host. This story terrified Western intelligence agencies. If Huawei built 5G networks in Europe and America, They'd have a permanent backdoor into every phone call, every data packet. This led to the Great Ban. The U.S. banned Huawei from networks, pressured allies to do the same. It was the first successful pushback against the copycat engine. But the war is far from over, because China evolved. They're not just copying anymore. They're innovating in areas the West ignored. Drones, solar panels, batteries. China dominates not because they stole the tech, but because they scaled it. If you make millions of batteries, you get better at making batteries. You drive costs down. You learn efficiencies. It's the learning curve. And China is riding it faster than anyone. But there's a cost, a human cost. And it might be the only thing that stops them. The engine is overheating. In Shenzhen and Beijing, there's a culture called 996. Work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, 72 hours weekly. It's expected. Complain and you're fired. This brutal pace fueled Alibaba, Tencent, TikTok. It created wealth for founders. But for workers, it created exhaustion.